these lectures. And I have a YouTube channel, but I'll make a particular playlist for this class, and then I'll make an announcement later today with like a link to the playlist. So if you end up missing a session, you can access it in that way. Also, yeah, I wanted to mention, and some of you might have noticed this already, I put up an attendance category on Moodle, like under the general resources information. And so the purpose of that is to create a kind of extra credit opportunity. So my idea is starting this week, so last week is kind of free, I'll just count everybody present, but starting this week, if you only miss one class session, then I'll give you a couple points of extra credit to add to your overall grade at the end, which could be very helpful if you're on the cusp of a letter grade or of a plus or a minus or something like that. Because, I mean, attending these sessions, discussions, and lectures and so forth should be its own kind of pedagogical reward. I mean, after all, you are adults and you are self-consciously enrolled students in this class. So it's really up to you whether you want to make the most of it, but it's beneficial for the whole to have more people come. So I'm trying to incentivize that to the extent that's at least reasonable. So I made the attendance setup such that you, the student, can report your own attendance. So I'll mention it close to the beginning of every class session, just to remind you to take some time if you want. It's not going to count against you, even if you're, at least by Moodle's light, it's 100% absent for every session. It's not going to count against you. So it's only for extra credit purposes. But if you could try to remember to report your attendance on Moodle, that would be helpful for you. And I'll periodically check to make sure that the roster of attendees for our Zoom sessions actually matches what you're reporting. Not that I don't trust you or anything, but just to keep everybody more or less honest. All right, so we have, let's see, our first presentation coming up this week in connection to this week's assignment for reading, and that is John Perry's dialogue on immortality and personal identity. So Noel and Amanda, last I checked, were two who are signed up for the first group, for group one. Was there a third participant? Do you guys know? I haven't checked. I can look right now, but
I don't recall there being. I think I checked right before class.
okay, let me just take a look. I'll take a look now at any rate, just to see who is outstanding in terms of a group enrollment. Yeah, so we have two signed up for the first group presentation. The limit is set at 3 for each of these groups. So it looks like next week's group is full. That's good. So we'll be talking about Descartes, but specifically for next week, for Thursday, that will be Avicenna's Floating Man Thought Experiment, and also John Pollock's very, very short story. It's like 1 or 2 pages. And then group 3, there are 2 of 3 students, so that is in connection to Hume's No Self, or more specifically, the Buddhist Heart Sutra and Thich Nhat Hanh's notion of inner being. Group 4 is full, so that's the discussion of Ursula K. Le Guin in connection to Hegel. Group 5 is full, so that's James Baldwin in connection to Plato. Group 6 is full, Guy de Maupassant in connection again to good old Hume. Group 7 has only 1, which is curious. So, I mean, you might not have looked at the stuff yet, anticipating what we'll be turning to in the weeks to come, but students generally find the discussion for group 7, I think that's week 8, to be a lot of fun. And so you might consider, if you haven't yet already, you might consider enrolling in that group. I mean, you get to talk about like time travel and dinosaurs and shit. So, I mean, why wouldn't you? And then the next week looks like we've got 2 of 3. And so that's where we'll talk about W.E.B. Du Bois, specifically his 1920 short story, short science fiction story or speculative fiction story, The Comet. And then finally, group 9 has only 1 of 3 participants. So it looks like we need someone for this week. So if you haven't signed up already, so we need someone for Thursday. We need someone or 2 for week 7 or week 8. That's group 7. 1 for group 8, and then 2 more for group 9. And I'll be pretty blunt and honest. The Donna Haraway reading is yeah, it's without a doubt the most challenging reading of the course. So that will be a difficult task, but it's really great. Donna Haraway is probably my favorite living philosopher, and she's professor emeritus right now at Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz. And I sadly, unsuccessfully invited her to give a campus lecture last year. I was a little hurt by that, but she was friendly in her in her decline. Okay, so yeah, are there any questions about that? So if you haven't signed up for a group, there are a few openings, so you might want to do that already. Oh, so there's some business going on in the chat. Let me see. Oh, okay, you were looking for it. Okay, good. Yeah, so it's right above attendance. So it's under that first area on Moodle labeled general information and resources or something like that. General resources information or something like that. Okay. All right, so any questions or issues? So Noel and Amanda, are you pretty comfortable with the assignment? Or do you have any questions about it? It's always a little
Yeah,
disconcerting.
not that I can think of right off the top of my head. I guess, is it basically taught in, how am I going to say this? Are we basically just telling the audience, you guys, what is being discussed in the dialogue, or is it our point of view on what is being said, if that makes sense?
It is really completely up to you, and
Okay.
your group dynamic, whatever it is that you're interested in, even as individuals within the group. So you can make it more expository, as you were suggesting, just sort of unpack or walk us through what you take to be the most salient elements of the text or argument, or you could make it more exploratory, where you enlist the class by posing certain questions. And it could be questions for which you have no answer, right? You're actually trying to engage us in a shared inquiry to figure out some difficult problems. Or you could be critical of certain moves in the argument. If you're dealing with an argument, you could go beyond the text and appeal to perhaps other writings or other media that you find to be relevantly connected or helpful. So it's really up to you, however you guys want to do it. But the idea is that you take ownership over the assigned reading for that class session for roughly, 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes. There's not exactly a hard limit. And that can be adjusted too, depending upon if you do decide to make it a more shared exploratory approach where you're asking questions and so forth.
All right.
Yeah.
That helps a lot. Thank you so much.
Okay, any other questions about that? And you're free to use media if you want to prepare like a series of PowerPoint slides or share a video or images or whatever else. That's completely fine. So Amanda, are you good with all that, or any questions? Okay, cool. And I'm sorry I didn't respond to your email about missing class last week. I meant to do so, but I appreciate you letting me know. Okay. All right, so we are now officially beginning the first real substantial thematic unit of the course, dealing with personal identity and selfhood. And so the purpose for assigning the John Perry dialogue is manifold, really. So first thing to note in terms of the literary genre is we're dealing with another dialogue. And so I thought that it would be a nice segue from an ancient Platonic dialogue to a kind of contemporary approximation of that form. And then just looking a little bit ahead next week, we'll be turning to a different philosophical genre, and that is the meditation. So we'll be reading Descartes' Meditations for Tuesday. And so that's one reason. And another reason is not so much to talk about the specific rhetorical or dialectical even moves of the argument as it's undertaken dialogically between the characters, but really as a kind of launching point for our discussion of personal identity more broadly. And in the background, withdrawn in the background, but substantially, argumentatively, conceptually present in this piece of writing are a number of historically significant philosophers whose views are represented by different characters. And so today I want to spend most of the time discussing the view of the 18th century British empiricist philosopher John Locke. And if you guys are familiar with John Locke at all, it's most likely in the context of social political philosophy. But he was very much influential in the area of metaphysics and epistemology. So metaphysics being, what, does anyone remember what that branch of philosophy is?
Well, metaphysical being like beyond the physical. So like the institutions and systems that influence our world through like the mental plane or the organizational efforts of, psyche or consciousness or what have you.
Yeah, that's right. That's correct. But that's a little more narrow. So metaphysics includes that, but it's a very broad field. But you're right about the etymology. So meta as the prefix in the Greek word suggests beyond, or it could mean after in a spatial or temporal sense. That is the sense of succession. And just for a little bit of innocuous kind of philosophical history, that's actually the ultimate origin of the word in its even current usage. So these medieval and late ancient commentators of Aristotle, who, by the way, was so profoundly important that for centuries he was simply referred to as the philosopher, Aristotle, and everyone knew who you're talking about. But commentators who were going over his work engaged with a book that he put forward called The Physics, which is about the nature of nature, right? So from Greek, physics or ta physika, physis is the Greek word which really means how we understand or what we mean by the word in English like nature now. And so it's an account of what it means to exist as an entity insofar as that entity is natural. And Aristotle has a particular understanding or interpretation of what that entails. And so he published another book after the Physics, and it had no straightforward or clear title. And so the commentators called it Metaphysica, which just means after the physics. But now we've imported a great deal of significance and nuance into that category and title. But as a fundamental division in the history of philosophy, metaphysics is the area that investigates the fundamental nature of reality. And so if you hold, for instance, as a physicalist would, or a materialist, such as is represented by the character Gretchen Weyrob in this week's reading, well, then you would still have a metaphysics, but you would say all of reality is simply material or physical, which would exclude from that domain anything like ghosts or gods or angels or fairies or whatever else, right? So even a hard-nosed scientific physicalist still subscribes to a kind of metaphysics. This is one of the points I was subtly advancing early on last week when just trying to characterize the very nature of the philosophical enterprise. Even if you deny the import of metaphysical speculation, that is in itself a presupposition of a kind of metaphysics. So metaphysics is impossible to escape. Even if we don't have in each of our own cases a really fleshed out, substantial, self-conscious understanding of the whole of reality, just to be able to get by in an everyday sense, we have some kind of liminal understanding of what that reality is. And so in metaphysical philosophy, we're really trying to mine the depths of these assumptions or presuppositions about how material nature and beyond, just in terms of reality itself, functions, trying to bring these presuppositions to the foreground. And so Locke is beyond his significance in this intellectual history as a contributor to the social contract tradition, for which he's mostly remembered, because he contributed in that role to our current system of government in the United States. He was a metaphysician and an epistemologist too, and part of that was to focus on the very nature of self or personal identity. And so it's to a large extent still John Locke that we turn to for our shared understanding of what constitutes a person, right? What it is that makes a person. And so we'll talk quite a bit about that today. So are there any questions so far? But I wanted to, as I mentioned last week, before getting into today's discussion and reading, I wanted to take a little bit more time to wrap up some things with the Plato reading from last week. So does that sound good? Any questions before I share the screen? Okay. All right. So I don't want to take too much time with this. But if there are any questions that you have that might have come up in your response to the discussion forum for last week, or in the engaged reading, and it's not something that we've addressed explicitly, feel free to jump in and ask. You can interrupt me. Okay. So there's just a couple things I wanted to reflect on together a bit more. So there's the famous scene, which some of you commented on in the annotations. And so, by the way, too, I just want to remind you guys that that is one of the components, the evaluative components that will contribute to your overall grade, the engaged reading assignment. So most of the readings, including this week's reading and last week's, so Plato and John Perry, they're set up through the hypothesis application, which is a social annotation application. Most of you completed the required annotations for last week, but some of you didn't. So I just wanted to make sure you guys are remembering that. So if you still want to go back, if you weren't able to do it for whatever reason, to last week's reading and put in your 2 annotations, which is really just a comment. So engaging in a shared kind of or mutually accessible commentary on the text, you can do that, and I'll still give you a grade, so it's not too late. Okay, so I wanted to take some time to go back to some of these moments. So some of you in your annotations reflected on just the audacity of the Socratic persona. He's basically saying, I am a gift from God to the city of Athens. And so this is more or less around the same time when he's put in a position, as was typical for this kind of legal system in Athens. The defendant or the accused who is ultimately convicted of the indictment, he's given an opportunity, he or she is given the opportunity to propose a penalty. And did anyone pick up on Socrates' proposal, his first proposal? So what did he say? Again, the translation is a little awkward or clunky, so the comedic aspect might have been lost on your reading as a first go. But did anyone notice what he said?
You're saying like, what did he propose for? I think he was saying he committed no crime, and that it was a crime. The first crime was like an ancient crime, being the crime of like how they're kind of indoctrinated to think that they know when they do not, and how the present crime is individuals that are too like boisterous or too egotistical of themselves to understand that they're actually fools. And he's just pointing out that they're fools, so there's no crime to mention other than the ancient crime, the crime that which these fools are doing, which are, pretty much being triggered by him telling them that they're fools. And that's not necessarily a crime because they are fools. It's just saying the truth. So he committed no crime, and therefore there isn't any reason to punish him because he's just a truth giver. He's not like, and he believes in demigods and gods, so he's not like going against the church state. He just thinks they're pretty much like academic fools that are really, really, you know, slanderous and drugs and being all funky, and that's why their civilization's collapsing because they're too stupid to see that they don't know the truth.
Yeah, so not only does he say, I committed no crime, but he says, I actually, as is reflected here, offered profound benefit, incomparable benefit. Therefore, my penalty ought to be a reward. And he says, and a just reward would be maintenance in the Prytaneum. But maintenance is this sort of clunky word which doesn't translate well from the Greek. What he's actually proposing is quite inflammatory. He's saying that, so imagine the Prytaneum is like a food court. So he's saying, because I have given you such a tremendous and inimitable benefit, you should give me free lunch every day in the food court because I don't have a lot of money and I can't afford exactly to feed myself because I spend all of my time harassing you and annoying the shit out of you. So therefore, you should reward me for that and buy me lunch every day. And so this strikes many as perhaps incongruous with his stated humility, which is then understood to be kind of ironic, right? So when Socrates says, I know that I know nothing, we ought to, based on an interpretation of his courtroom antics, we ought to interpret that ironically, that he really does know things or something like that. But I submit that we really should take Socrates at his word, that Socrates knows that he knows nothing. That is, he knows that as a mortal, as a finite being, in contradistinction to the gods, any wisdom available for him is worthless. So I think he's being sincere in that. But that doesn't mean that he thinks, excuse me, that doesn't mean that he thinks as one who possesses this peculiar sort of wisdom, this human wisdom, or as we refer to it now quite often, Socratic wisdom. He doesn't think that that makes him inferior as a human being, but he is also earnest, so we should take him seriously at his word here, that he is superior to other human beings for that reason. And this is a little strange because you might think, okay, why is Socrates superior? He's superior because he doesn't know anything. Well, guess what? I don't know fucking shit either. Does that make me brilliant? I can just say, oh, I don't know anything. So now I ought to be revered or respected as some source of profound insight. Well, I think we should understand then what he means by this kind of wisdom. We should take it seriously and try to unpack it more carefully. Yeah, go ahead. You're raising your hand there.
Yeah. Basically, I feel like it's kind of like a timeless wisdom because, like, you know, he's taking the approach that, like, he's aware of like a sense of timelessness in this wisdom, and that gives lots of power because it's more, it ages better. It's more enduring because he's taking a kind of like timeless approach to his understanding of knowledge and what will happen, and having his cup kind of relatively empty, he's allowed to fill it up more and kind of have more exposure to more information. He's, you know, the inquisitive mind essentially opposed to the I know everything mind. You know, it's a
great. That's great. So imagine, what does it mean concretely, practically, for one who is self-consciously in a position of knowledge of no knowledge, right? So this is what I described as a higher order wisdom, or a higher order knowledge, which corresponds as the mirror image to a kind of higher order ignorance, as it were. That is to say, in Socrates' acknowledgement that he knows nothing, he's admitting ignorance, right? So in that sense, ignorance is not blameworthy. It's ignorance of your ignorance. So that's the higher order ignorance I was talking about, which is not only blameworthy, but if Socrates is correct, it's the most shameful sort of ignorance there is. and a tremendous source of destruction and violence that we should be aware of. And so knowing that you don't know, as I'm sorry, what was your name? You were just talking?
Joshua.
Joshua, as Joshua is suggesting, using the metaphor of an emptier cup. If you think you know everything, so to go back to the example of Euthyphro from Euthyphro, the Euthyphro dialogue, which narratively precedes this one, where Socrates is talking to this so-called expert on the nature of piety. And that knowledge or pretense to knowledge, this misguided sort of prejudicial misunderstanding of one's competence, is not in itself harmless. It's about to send Euthyphro on the way as a person of action to condemn his own father to death, perhaps unjustly. And yet at the end of the dialogue, it's shown by Socrates that Euthyphro has no idea ultimately what is really demanded of him in the sense of being pious, yet he's about to do what he takes to be pious, right? So not knowing that you really don't know can result in disastrous consequences, right? So when Socrates then appears arrogant in the courtroom and he says things like, I am a gift from the fucking gods to you people, we should take that seriously too, because it's no small thing. It's very difficult to achieve the kind of wisdom he's espousing, to legitimately know that you don't know. Okay, yeah, Joshua, go ahead.
Just real quickly, yeah, it's pretty profound because I talked to a woman who got a bachelor degree in psychology and like a dual degree within some type of molecular science or biological science degree, and she said the precipice of her whole education was that she learned the parameter of what we do know, so she could start exploring what they don't know. Like everything was to show her what they do know, just so she could start exploring what they don't know. And like, this is what they know, this is what they don't know, and so it's everything has questions, everything's not concrete, everything is mutable. And lastly, because I'm into like, I guess, medical science and like that, and basically what the cardiovascular doctors knew in 1970, 50% of what they thought they knew is proven to be false by our today's standards. Yep. 50%. So one out of every two things they thought they knew for sure has been proven inaccurate by our current modern practices, but that might be proven inaccurate in the future as well. But this is showing how fast tides can shift in the course of 40 years within something that's supposed to be absolute and concrete.
Exactly, right. So this sort of Socratic wisdom is then found as a trace, as a fundamental hallmark of the contemporary scientific method as we understand it, even in simplistic or caricaturized terms. That is a sense in which science is never complete. It's in principle revisable. So we should interpret Socratic wisdom as playing a role conceptually in the background of this sort of development. And that's why I mentioned in the very first week of our engagement with these things that philosophy and science aren't really mutually opposed or separate disciplines. What we understand to be the natural, physical, or social sciences grew out of philosophy. And it wasn't until relatively recently that we even had different pieces of terminology to capture these intellectual spaces or domains. So someone like Isaac Newton was self-consciously a natural philosopher, right? He thought of himself as a philosopher. Okay. But this gadfly image is very interesting to think about. And it's interesting, I think, in a profound political register. And so this is an opportunity to unpack what's really the inheritance of a radical political philosophy from both Socrates and Plato, much more radical actually than Aristotle would develop it in his own way. So what is it? So what is a gadfly? First of all, does anyone know what that is?
It's like a horsefly that kind of nicks at you.
Good. Yeah, it's a horsefly. And so Socrates gives us an analogy. There's the horsefly and there's the horse. And so to what are these elements analogical? So what are they corresponding to? So who's the horsefly and who's the horse in this scenario?
Socrates would be the fly, while the people of Athens are the horse. in that they're stagnant, doing nothing, and he said lazy, and that he's running around with his horrible questions, trying to get the horse to move.
Good, exactly. But lazy in what sense? So maybe to answer that, we can go back to the moment where he expresses perhaps the most important moment of the dialogue, the linchpin of the dialogue, this appeal to the examined life or the unexamined life. So he says, you will think you won't take me seriously further still if I tell you that the unexamined life is not worth living for human beings. But how does he describe this examined life as a practice? So what does it mean? What are the specific examples he uses, if anyone remembers?
I don't remember exactly, but I remember him speaking with something like, basically, like in right here it says, like, reflecting on virtues, living a virtuous life. Basically, an examined life, maybe something along the lines of like, kind of doing things for the good and not for self-preservation or like self-interest, but more like what would make the gods happy, doing what is right, doing what is just, opposed to doing what fills your pockets or fills your belly.
Yeah, good. So you mentioned a few concepts in your answer. So thinking about what is good, thinking about what is just. So we always already have some liminal understanding, an operative understanding, just in terms of living a basic life, of what something like good means, what it entails, what it involves, what something like just means. That is, you have to have some prior grasp of what justice is before you can see an event before you in the world or a state of affairs and remark on it. That is unjust, or that is just. For such an event or object to show itself, to come to presence in the light of justice, that is, to show itself as just or as good, you have to have some prior knowledge of what that even means, of what that domain is, in which something can show up as a relevant example of it. Yet, we typically don't spend much time reflecting on that pre-reflective grasp or apprehension of what these concepts are. So for example, we might think, well, good is just what gives me pleasure. So I'm just going to keep, pursuing that. And so having to do this, having to defer to someone else's needs, having to respect someone else's judgments or desires, that's a source of pain. So I'm not going to do that, right? Or just, you might have a very circumscribed or very narrow understanding of what justice entails. And if you don't reflect on that, if you don't think about it in depth to expand that domain, well, then you might miss certain examples of injustice in the world. And you might actually contribute to that injustice, perhaps without even recognizing it, right? So that's what he means by the examined life. So we all know what justice is. We all know what good means. But do we? Do we really know? And the suggestion is that you could spend an entire lifetime engaging with these concepts and still uncover more layers, still pull out more dimensions, insofar as the concept at issue corresponds to particular features of a real concrete experience in the world. In the face of such an experience, you might reflect back on this operative concept of justice or good or whatever and come to terms with it in a new way. So that's what he's demanding. And this is especially important for those who are engaged in politics, those who pursue positions of power, who would pretend or perhaps even earnestly have the notion that their purpose as occupying or pursuing one of these positions of power is to take the whole state, the whole social body towards more and more good, or as the case may be, away from problematic sources of injustice in the world. But if that person hasn't really taken the time to engage seriously with the concept, the whole problematic of something like the just or the good or the true, then they're not trustworthy stewards of state. They can't be trusted to deliver the social body to liberation or freedom or justice or good. So that's what he's insisting on as the examined life. And so as a gadfly, when he says, or a horsefly, when he says the state of Athens is lazy or sluggish, it's lazy and sluggish precisely with respect to this practice of self-examination. So that's what he's attempting to goad the state into. But I think it's helpful to reflect, and this is anachronistic, of course, because, during the classical period of Hellenic Athens, with figures like Socrates and Plato, Darwinian evolution was not yet a thing. Although I should point out that Empedocles, a famous pre-Socratic philosopher, anticipates Darwinian evolution by thousands of years. And then Aristotle, in his some of his biological work, rejects evolutionary theory out of hand. And so that posed a significant obstacle for the development of the life sciences for centuries. But this gadfly situation, you can think about the metaphor, I think, really helpfully by appeal to how we understand evolutionary change. So think about the relationship between the horsefly and the horse. Or in other words, to use the metaphor, the philosopher and the political state. So the horsefly obviously, the horse obviously wants to kill the fly, right? The horse hates the fly. The fly is obnoxious. The fly is bothering the horse, right? But to go on the other side of this relationship, does the fly want to kill the horse?
It wants the salt off its skin.
Yeah, and so in order to continue enjoying that, the horse has to live, right? It'll eventually, rot and decay, and the fly will have to move on to something else after, creating maggots and the repulsive flesh and all of that. But in any case, the fly is benefiting from the horse's body as a living body, as an organic body. So the fly has no desire for the horse's demise. So it's an asymmetrical relationship already. But think about now the means, the physical means by which a horse can at least attempt to kill the fly or to ward the fly away. What are parts of the horse's body that can facilitate that can help it to keep the fly at bay?
There's a lot of muscles that will twitch to get the flies off of them, and then they'll utilize things like their tail to try and swat them.
Yeah, like the tail that swishes, the mane, so they can whip their heads around, as you see, and the mane can sort of chase the flies away or bat them away. So the tail and the mane in particular, these are iconic physical features of the animal we label horse, by which we recognize a horse as a horse. Yet, evolutionarily, we might conclude that the horse developed these iconic features specifically because of the antagonism of the fly, which means that the horse can't even be the horse that it is without this sort of oppositional or adversarial relationship between the horse and the fly. So the horse wants to kill the fly, but whether it knows it or not, the horse in its very being depends upon the fly and the particular way in which the fly is relating to the horse, which isn't exactly pleasant, of course, for the horse. So then the horse, just in terms of being a horse, needs the fly. And we might say then, going on the other side of the metaphor or analogy, that the state, unless it is to rush headlong into its own blighted or sort of blind ruin, it needs philosophical reflection, right? So there is a kind of tension, there is a kind of antagonism or confrontation, but we should interpret it as to some extent fruitful and productive, and in any case necessary, right? So it's not a tension or an antagonism that we would want to dissolve or to resolve in any final way. And furthermore, the philosopher, just as the gadfly relies upon the bodily presence of the horse for its own sustenance, and in fact, to be the horsefly that it is, the philosopher needs the state, right? Without a more or less coherent, consistent, and stable political, social organization, there's no room for the luxury of philosophy, right? So it's a mutual antagonism, but a mutually fruitful or productive antagonism. Sophia said I was starting to cut out. Is that true for everyone, or?
No.
Okay, sorry. But did everyone hear what I just said?
Mhm.
Or do I need to repeat? Okay.
I
But does
get
that make sense? This kind of fruitful, but in any case, antagonistic relationship between the philosopher or the freedom of philosophical thought and the state or the political entity.
One way to kind of phrase it too is like, it seems like Socrates is kind of like poking the state's ego, and the state has to make a case to protect its ego, and making a case for protecting its ego has to kind of reflect on itself. So therefore it's kind of like a symbiotic relation that way. But obviously Socrates, he's, has the protection of the state. Back in those days, it was very dog eat dog world. So he's probably happy being a powerhouse that Athens once was for the time.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so this is the examined life thing, to connect to the gadfly scene. So if I say again that the greatest good of man is daily to converse about virtue and all that concerning which you hear me examining myself and others, so what is the pious? What is the good? What is the just? And that the life which is unexamined is not worth living for human beings, that you are still less likely to believe. So this is what I was talking about last time in terms of this continuum of knowledge. Okay, thanks for letting me know. Yeah, that might be true. So sometimes your camera is more taxing on the Wi-Fi. So it might help if you cut that off. Sorry. Okay, so when he says the unexamined life is not worth living for human beings, what he means is that would be an inappropriate mode of existence with respect to the kind of being that the human is. So that would be to kind of place oneself as a mineral or as a plant in this sort of impossible space of perfect ignorance. Impossible in the sense that you're denying your own being. You're denying your call to conscience, you might say, as the sort of being you are, which as finite, but as in any case conscious and intellectual, you can examine these concepts that you take for granted. And so perfect knowledge is also inappropriate for human beings. That's what we would call superhuman wisdom. And so we are always already, when it comes to knowledge-bearing entities or human beings, we are always already somewhere along this continuum between the impossible pole of perfect ignorance and the equally impossible pole of perfect knowledge. Because even as an infant, as I mentioned last time, you're always already in a relationship with at least your mother. And the terms of that relationship involve fundamental human attunements to reality. So as a very young child, you're open to intimacy, to care, to love, and to truth. So before you can even learn what it means to offer a truthful expression or to pursue the truth as opposed to a lie or falsity, you desire the truth, right? You want your parents to tell you the truth. You're not indifferent if it turns out they're giving you a bunch of nonsense, right? And so I don't want to spend too much longer with this, but recall one of those first allegations or accusations that Socrates was like the sophists or the pre-Socratics, engaged in natural philosophy or speculating about metaphysics. And he's at pains to distance himself not only from the sophists in their rhetorical regimen, but also from the metaphysical interests, these kind of abstruse and from his point of view, impossible interests of the pre-Socratics, studying things in the sky and below the earth. So phenomena of reality that are in principle beyond human access. Why does he want to distance himself? Well, imagine, so let's talk about what he has in mind and his repudiation of natural philosophy. So imagine this sphere is the cosmos, literally the intelligible everything or all, the universe as we know it. And then every dot represents a fact or an object or an event, some intuitable or recognizable state of affairs that can be explained. And so if you were to obtain superhuman wisdom, that's what the Greeks call kosmotheoros. And so that derives from the root word theoros and then the prefix cosmo having to do with cosmos. But theoros, that's the Greek root from which we get words in English like theory or theoretical. And it really means a kind of disinterested spectatorial knowledge. So like if you go to a baseball game or something, or you watch one on television as a spectator, your engagement with the event, your observation of it is going to have no bearing on how that event unfolds. You're not going to contribute to it. And furthermore, what goes on in the event isn't going to, in any really significant, lasting way, impact your existence or your life. Unless, of course, you have a bunch of money bet on the game or whatever else. So as a theoros, then, we are engaged with, and for Aristotle, theoros or theoria, theoretical activity, was primarily about understanding what's going on in the so-called superlunary domain. So what's happening astronomically beyond the moon, because he understood those astral or cosmic bodies to be the most enduring and unchanging, and they would ultimately terminate in the contour of the unmoved mover, or God, the first cause of everything. And so God would then be, for Aristotle, the ultimate object of theoria, because your understanding of God is not going to impact God's existence whatsoever. You're observing that being as a spectator. But to achieve that kind of spectatorial wisdom with respect to the totality of reality, you would have to be out of the sphere, right? You would have to be up here. You would have to be out here. You would have to be under here and here. You would have to be everywhere to pin it all down as a whole. Yet, as it turns out, as a finite being, you are one of these dots, right? You are somewhere within this sphere. So you have no distance or space from which to gain a purchase on the totality of the real, of all phenomena that make up the cosmos. So you have a perspective. So if you're here, if you can see my cursor, you're trying to gain some understanding of this phenomenon, this dot here. Well, you can only see it from one angle. Now, you can maybe build a kind of community, so to speak, with these other dots, these other perspectival points, to gain a greater, broader, more full apprehension of this dot, but it's still circumscribed by particular limits or finite perspectives. And the moment you focus on that dot with all of your energy, you are ignoring or covering over these other dots, right? So that's the ultimate task. You have to live, you have to be as a finite individual, which means you have to be as a perspective. And so I just wanted to give an example of rhetoric again. So this is rhetoric in advertising. We talked a bit about rhetoric as it operates within politics or law and other such spheres. But in advertising. So every few years, KFC comes up with some horrifying abomination. And this is one of them, the chizza. And so as you can see, this is a pizza whose crust is made of fried chicken, right? So notice what's going on in this image, this advertising image. So you've got this folksy like pizza pan here. It's presented as delicious or appealing. But notice that in any of these ads, yeah, it is a thing, and you should be terrified of this, Tiffany. You're right. Notice that in these ads, they're not going to say, yeah, this is great and all, but if you eat enough pizzas, you're going to get gout or you're going to die of diabetes or something. So that's to speak again to this careful dynamic of rhetoric, the dynamic of concealing and revealing. Certain things have to be hidden, right, in order for this to actually appeal to those desires that you have, those biases or whatever that you might not be consciously aware of. And those desires have to be more or less kept hidden in order for them to serve as a helpful source for advertising as such, the very efforts of advertising. And so those are just some quick conclusions to walk through together. So rhetoricians like lawyers, politicians, and advertisers share the same fundamental aim, which is to convince others, usually a widely varied group and a multitude, to convince others of something. And again, because we're dealing with rhetoric and not dialectic, independently of whether it's true. And they do so, as I was just describing, by navigating a dynamic of economy of revealing some things and concealing others, which is determined, of course, by the relevant context. So who the audience is, what you know about this withdrawn background of biases, prejudices, anxieties, and so forth. Whereas the aim of dialectic, as deployed philosophically, is to bring these implicit elements from out of the background, that is, to make them explicit. Rhetoric effectively functions only when they're kept hidden, such as the deleterious health effects or consequences of, eating a pizza every day. But as of course demonstrated in Socrates' defense, that is, by his irascible behavior in the courtroom, it's impossible to illuminate and diffuse every dangerous assumption at once, given that there's always this obscure background at play that we can never escape. And this is the point I was making about how we can never, as humans, achieve the role or status of the kosmotheoros, that is, the theoretician of everything. And so this is why Socrates says that if he's convicted, it won't be because of Meletus, Lycon, and Anytus, those that brought the real indictment to the court, but because of rhetoric, that is, those ancient accusations in front of which he is forced to only shadow box. There's no one with whom to engage in dialectic to defend himself. So then, lastly, what is human wisdom? It's knowing that you don't know. Knowing, in other words, that the path to wisdom for mortal human beings does not terminate at any final possession of truth, knowledge, or whatever else. And so in bold, I have here a way to reconceptualize or to reorient ourselves to the very notion of truth. We shouldn't consider truth as something, an object that we can possess, achieve, transmit, leave aside, or whatever else. But truth operates as a phenomenon, that is, something that shows itself in the way of a kind of urgency that inspires us towards us. Like I was characterizing children, they have this sort of, you might say, native appetite for the truth that draws them towards it. And then also a norm that tells us when our efforts to find the truth are adequate or inadequate, when we have achieved something that can legitimately be described as true, and when we are far from that. Okay, so does that make sense? There any questions about this?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. So I just have a comment.
Sure.
Basically, like that. Say back to like Socrates, like knowing that he knows not being timeless. Like imagine like the look on those guys' faces, knowing like that their gods would be not held as a religion, 2,000 years later, that no one really believes in those. I mean, there are some people that still believe, but you're talking a very minority population that pretty much their whole foundation of their existence is no longer seen as truth, but as, you know, how would you say it, like a fictional kind of
Mhm.
thing. So that'd be pretty interesting for them to be able to see that in their lifetime. They're like, damn it, Socrates.
Yeah, and no one talks about Meletus or Lycon or Anytus anymore, except mostly in reference to scenes like this that we draw from Plato. But so this is the last thing I want to talk about, just to make for this discussion, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll get into the John Perry dialogue. But is anyone who studies psychology familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect? So I want to make a contemporary connection here from Socrates to modern psychology. So is anyone familiar with this? So
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, so Dunning and Kruger are psychological researchers that first proposed or conducted this research in the late 90s. And then there was another important paper that I think was published in 2011. But the idea is that those who are most dumb are least equipped to recognize the extent of their dumbness. And so that's the human condition, right? That's the problem. I'm trying to, okay, so there's some activity in the chat. Permanent camp, I'm not stupid. Yeah, I feel you. Yeah. Ignorance is bliss to some extent. You might say that that's a part of this. Unless, of course, as Socrates suggests, the importance of philosophical speculation, or not speculation, but concrete practice, you might actually, be going off a cliff for all you know, and you're blissful up until that point, right? But this is the problem, and this kind of connects to what you were saying, Joshua, earlier about the psychological researcher who found in coming to terms with one little area, the most important thing from that perspective or vantage point is to see the much huger area comparatively that is not yet explored or understood, right? But the problem is, unless you traverse the valley of despair, you will never know how little you know. And so the human condition is such, as people like Bertrand Russell have pointed out, so a 20th century British philosopher, part of the tragedy of that condition, this fundamental human condition, is that those who are most careful, those who are most thoughtful, and most engaged with the truths of reality are the least confident. And those who don't know a goddamn thing are in many cases the most confident. And so I think that goes a long way in explaining the shittiness of this current world and of virtually every moment that we can reflect on where we have these social problems. Okay, but any final comments or questions about this?
When you're dealing like social dynamics, like you have to demand enough authority to have your perspective enter the table of potential outcomes or dialogues that the group can engage on that might be a reasonable choice or decision to make. Because like I relate this like martial arts, like like I trained martial arts for like 12 years, and I mean, a lot of people are really, really confident until they meet someone that knows martial. Then it's like, whoa, this is not the same. And there's so many levels to it. Like I would be amateur in like my stamp game and my ground game, and there's like guys that are like way above me, and they say when they like they go with someone that's there's people that are way, way above them that like make them look stupid, and they're like, third degree black belts that been doing it for 25 years that are masters. And there's masters of masters.
Yeah.
There's even masters of masters. So like, for me, it's like knowing that those branches exist, even though I'm confident, but I know like I'm very, very amateur. But amateur is still better than 98% of people out there because people haven't even gone to the amateur level. Most people don't, and they're really confident too. Like, yeah, I got what it takes, but they haven't spent any time punching mitts or holding bags or doing anything. But they're super, super confident in their stand-up game. And it's like, okay,
Yeah, as is often the case, I'm right now reminded of the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, the character Mac. If anyone knows that show, he was always very confident about his abilities, his physical prowess as a martial artist or fighter, but it comes out repeatedly that he's never studied it at all, like in any way. Um, but he has this great confidence that he can protect their group and everything. But yeah, I'll probably refer to that show more than a few times over the course of the quarter. But so let me stop sharing and let's take just a few minutes break, and then we'll come back and jump into the John Perry dialogue. And we'll talk about the first night, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about John Locke's theory of personal identity. And we're going to do some discussion with each other too about different approaches to selfhood or personal identity. So let's just take a couple minutes of a break, and then we'll come back here and get back to work. So I'll see you guys in a few minutes. Hey, Micah, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm tired though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it you? I might be wrong about this. I'm thinking about the personal introductions forum. Was it you who mentioned that you're reading Emil Cioran?
Probably, yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. um, I only recently actually learned about Emil Cioran, and um, I study existentialism and so forth. So that's
Yeah,
actually really interesting.
I study a lot of existential nihilism.
Yeah, I'm actually teaching existentialism right now. It's a class I have today, really, at 1:30. Um, but it's a lot of fun. Today we're discussing Dostoevsky. Uh, but what would you recommend that I read from Charan? Because I haven't read anything of his.
So the one I'm reading right now, and it's a really good one, is called "The Trouble with Being Born."
So that's like his anti-natalist argument.
Yeah, it's his whole thing about how it kind of goes a step above usual nihilism of like why are we alive, but his goes further of why are we born at all,
Mhm.
and how death is not to want to die isn't to end, but to actually it's the nostalgia of before. It's a really interesting take, and he a lot of that book actually has to do with kind of the arguments of nihilism of like the wanting to die, because one of my favorite quotes of his is to die any time except when you have to, which is kind of like it's like a really good defense against like typical nihilist,
Mhm.
because the form of nihilism I'm a form of nihilist that's like an anti-nihilist. I'm like I don't know, I would consider it like a classical nihilist where a lot of people I think like uh what's his name, Frederick
Nietzsche.
Nietzsche, right?
Nietzsche. Yeah.
Yeah, Nietzsche. He I believe very prominently, despite being like the father of nihilism, that he's actually like he's his works are very anti-nihilistic.
No, no, no. Yeah, that's a misconception. Nietzsche is a complete anti-nihilist for sure.
And
Yeah.
I think a lot of nihilists are like that. I think nihilism is very misquoted as something to be, while nihilist philosophers are actually trying to promote anti-nihilism.
Yeah,
It's
that's a good way to think of existentialism more broadly. It's, I think, misunderstood as a sort of morbid or nihilistic way of thinking, but it's really hopeful and liberating in a lot of ways. But yeah, that's cool. So I'll check that book out. Thanks. All right, so let's get into this discussion on John Perry's dialogue. So I just first want to canvass the room, as it were, and get some first impressions. So what are some thoughts that you guys had on this dialogue? Um, and you might have gone beyond the first night, I'm not sure, but that's really what we're to focus on today. So the dialogue is made up of 3 conversations that take place over 3 different nights. But what are some first impressions about it?
I thought it was really interesting. I think it's cool because everyone who reads it, I feel like, can, like, if you read each of the nights, can kind of find maybe a theory that you have kind of resided with personally and then see the arguments against it. Like, that happened to me. Like, I read it last night and I felt like I resonated mostly with the third night argument of connecting identity to the brain, and then reading the arguments against that philosophically, and I was like, oh no, it's time to question everything again.
Yeah.
But I really liked it.
Cool, cool. Yeah, so we'll talk more about this on Thursday, but that's one aspect of Perry's approach that I find problematic. And we'll see more distinctly why next week when we talk about Descartes, because ultimately the distinction should be between the mind and the body, not the brain and the body, because from the Cartesian point of view as well, the brain is the body.
Yeah,
So
I
when
agree.
we talk about
Exactly.
mind-body dualism next week, we'll have to be very careful about that. Because, given the current status of neuroscience, it's very typical for one to just presuppose that there's a mind and brain identity, but that's actually something that we'll be calling into question. And it's also not universally accepted by those who work in cognitive science. So for example, there's the extended mind view, or the embodied mind view, which suggests that mind is a psychosocial phenomenon which can't be limited to the physical contours of the brain as an organ, right? So not all cognitive scientists or neuroscientific researchers embrace mind-brain identitarianism, although that is probably the most common approach in neuroscience and philosophy of mind. So we'll talk about that. But yeah, that's a good point to bring up, Tiffany. Thanks. Any other thoughts from the reading that you'd like to share? Yeah, Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that it's Perry writes it and like constructs the dialogue like a play, and I have like a bit of a background in theater, so reading his work compared to like Plato's text was very interesting, which Plato's text reads kind of like a monologue because it's mostly Socrates talking. But like seeing these different characters talk to each other, and having the text only be pretty much them talking to each other, I feel like helped me distinguish different perspectives on issues and things like that. And yeah, I thought it was a very interesting approach for philosophy, as opposed to just like reading a book of theory.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's very helpful for us in an intro to philosophy class. So you don't have to read Locke and then Hume and then Joseph Butler and all these sort of dry, which effectively serve as monologues because you're engaging with the particular voice of this or that historical philosopher. In this case, we can see them set in action, as it were. And so we can slough off then a lot of the difficulty and boredom of especially reading John Locke. We are going to be reading a fair bit of Hume, but Hume's a great writer. I would never punish you guys with any sort of substantial reading of Locke. You would want to like claw your eyes out. I don't know, it's pretty rough stuff. But yeah, so any other thoughts before we jump into this? Any other questions or? Okay, so so who can just lay out the scene for us? So what's going on in this dialogue?
Well, essentially, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, Werob or something like that.
Yeah.
Werob?
Yeah.
Yeah. So she's basically in her deathbed in the hospital after a motorcycle accident, and Miller and Cohen, I believe it is, come in to comfort her. And essentially, Miller in this dialogue, in this night, is trying to convince Werob that there is life after death, and that there is survival, and that she doesn't need to worry about dying. And so they're just talking back and forth, trying to prove and disprove each other about survival after death.
Good. So the first question to arise, given the circumstances, is whether or not Gretchen Werob can anticipate survival beyond bodily demise. So that's the first question. But then what's the question that devolves into?
Do we have a soul, basically? Or do we have like
yeah,
an
that's one of them.
immaterial?
That's one of them, right? But what's so even bigger than that? So before the idea of the soul is even floated as an option, what does the question turn to?
Is there even a self to remember, be remembered, and at what point does there stop being a self?
Yeah, good. Or what is the self? So if someone tells you, yeah, you're about to die right now, but you can reasonably anticipate survival beyond that event, you might ask, well, what is this, or who is this you that you're telling me can anticipate survival beyond this event, which in accordance with common sense and ordinary human experience would seem to be a limit event, right? The event of death itself, as we've talked about in different moments. So then the question of personal immortality devolves into the question of personhood as such, that is, of personal identity as such. In other words, what is the self? And so how that conversation gets going, though, is Weyrob says, you don't have to tell me from the point of view of a Christian chaplain, right? You don't have to tell me with your conviction that survival beyond bodily demise is probable. That is, it's something that I can anticipate, but only that it is possible in the minimal sense. And so that's the first conceptual distinction that's important for us to focus a little bit on and to clarify. So what exactly is she asking then? So she wants to know whether or not it's possible, leaving aside its degrees of probability. And so what does it mean to say possible in this sense? And this is, so I'm focusing on this because this is a concept that's important for the history of philosophy, in particular metaphysics and epistemology, that we'll have to turn to at different moments as we go ahead in the weeks to come.
Well, Weyrob refers to playing tennis as a great example of possibility, in that she lost she lost like 19 out of 20 games, but the one game that she did win against Miller, like, she felt confident now that she would keep playing and eventually win. There is that possibility of beating him at tennis.
Good.
So just that possibility is sometimes all you need to have hope, which is a good factor for survival.
Good, but in that scenario, which is a helpful example, but in that example, it seems though, and this is kind of Miller's response, it seems though that possibility in that sense is very low or minimal probability. So even if it's 1% possible that I can defeat you in tennis, that's sufficient for me to want to play you at all. But to be more precise philosophically, what she's getting at is reasoned conceivability, right? So that's what possibility means as a logical concept. And that's how we'll take it up again, especially when we turn to David Hume and his approach to epistemology. So possibility in the strict logical sense means conceivability. And according to Hume, as we'll see later on, that is the insuperable limit of thought. Which means I can conceive of all sorts of things which I understand to be perhaps physically impossible, right? So for example, I can conceive right now of a world in which I could suddenly sprout wings and fly out of my window here. I can conceive of it. I know that that's physically impossible, but it's not logically impossible. I can actually work out in some science fiction world how it is that I might make that happen at some point, right? But I cannot imagine standing, for example, standing and not standing at the same time. I can't even conceive of what that means. If I tell you I'm standing and I'm not standing at once, you can't even form a coherent mental picture of that. It's completely meaningless. And so that's the sense of impossible that we're confronting here. Or the notion of trying to make sense of a sentence like 2 + 2 = 12. You can't even conceive of that sum. It doesn't make any sense. So that's the sense of logical impossibility that we're dealing with. And that makes sense in this scenario because Weyrob is saying, given these facts, so I am going to die, right? At a particular moment in the very near future, my body and all of its organs will cease functioning, and then I will perish. I will cease to be entirely, even as a brute physical datum. And you're telling me that despite that, I will at some point in 1,000 years hence be alive and kicking and be able to engage in a conversation with you. she's saying that that seems to be inconceivable, given specifically the facts. So what we know about bodily death, what we know about time, and so forth. So what she's asking then is for Miller to tell a story in which the purported conceivability and hence possibility is laid out, is carefully and sensibly articulated. And that will mean that Weyrob will be able to anticipate in the future experiences or thoughts or events and so forth. And then from the vantage of that future state, this is the other direction, that person will be able to look back and recollect or remember events of one's own personal history, right? So then if she is to survive and we're able to conceive of a scenario in which that is possible beyond bodily demise, then the conditions that have to be met for conceivability seem to be proper anticipation of future experiences and then proper recollection or memory of past experiences and events. So then anticipation and memory from the very beginning of the dialogue seem to be crucial elements for the constitution of identity as such, right? And why is that so important for Weyrob? So why is it the case that if it turns out in 1,000 years, there is a person who seems to be Weyrob in this heavenly venue, why is it so important that that person or individual should be able to recall Weyrob's life experiences in this world? So what is the connection there between anticipation, memory, and identity? So think about, so this is where an objection comes up with the Kleenex box. So think about the Kleenex box example. So remember Miller's first response is, well, if that's all you're asking, well, we can cut this short pretty fast, right? All you have to do is conceive of there being someone exactly similar to you in the future. So someone that you could recognize as Weyrob and so forth. Even though the body that at our point in history and lived experience was Weyrob has been entirely destroyed, right? So you can conceive of this future Weyrob that's similar in every relevant respect to the past Weyrob. So what's so difficult? And so what does she say in response to that? What's the problem?
Was it the idea that the this heavenly person that looks like Weyrob would be kind of like an imposter in a way?
Yeah, so we're very kind of sloppy in our everyday discourse or language with concepts like identity. We sometimes use the concept to mean exact similarity, such as when we use it to describe identity or identical twins, right? But even if you have an identical twin brother or sister, you do not, strictly speaking, share identity. And so there's an important distinction to be made between qualitative identity and numerical identity. And so this is just to look ahead to Hume. He'll use different language. He'll refer to qualitative identity as specific identity. So I'll mention that again because it can be confusing as to what he means by specific, but he's really referring to species. So for example, it's true that you and I, all of you and myself, share identity in the sense of specific or species identity. That is, we're identical insofar as we are human. And so your identical twin is identical to you in a similar way, especially if all of their observable physical features are more or less interchangeable with your own, right? So that you might not even know exactly with whom you're dealing when you're looking at someone because of the possibility that you could be talking to their twin. And I've experienced that. And Twin siblings like to play with people sometimes to confuse them in that way. But they're not the same person because they don't share the same strict identity in the sense of numerical identity. And so then if there is someone like the Kleenex box, right? So Wayrob says, what you're telling me is comparable to if I said, so there's this Kleenex box, I'm setting it on fire, it's reduced to ashes, I'm smashing them, I flush them down the toilet, but I tell you in 2 hours when you go home, that very same Kleenex box will be on your shelf. You'd be speaking nonsense. But Miller says, well, maybe you just mean that it's a comparable Kleenex box in every way. It looks exactly like the old Kleenex box. But that would be just like telling you, oh, don't worry, you're going to die in a few hours, but God's going to conjure up an entity that resembles you in every way, and you'll get to live, or excuse me, that version will get to live forever. Well, that won't be comforting to you because like Noel mentioned, that's an imposter, right? You would want to be the same person, and that means anticipation, and that means, importantly, continuity of experience across time, such that there is no break in the flow, you might say, of most simply personhood and slightly more complicated consciousness, right? That's what we're really talking about. And that's kind of Locke's approach. But we don't really get into the meat of Locke's approach to the question of personal identity until the second night. But I wanted to talk a bit about Locke's theory in any case today. But actually before Wayrob and Miller discuss the Lockean sort of consciousness or apperception approach to personal identity, they mention Descartes, right? So that's important, right? So where does Descartes come up in this? Did anyone catch his introduction? Miller mentions Descartes by name. And so we are turning to Descartes specifically next week on Tuesday to read 2 of his 6 meditations. Well, this is right where Miller is rebutting her use of the Kleenex box analogy, right? So when she clears up the misuse of language of identity and says, no, you're talking about exact similarity, such as would hold between 2 identical twins. I am talking about identity. And that's when Miller says, oh, okay, well, it's a problem only if you're like the Kleenex box, but you're not like the Kleenex box. There's something more to you than the Kleenex box, which is just cardboard and glue. So what is the more to Gretchen Wayrob than her body?
The immaterial soul, I think.
Right, the soul. And that's what Descartes gives us. So it's to Descartes that we turn, as we will next week, for a substantial unfolding of at least the most coherent and influential concept of the soul in the Western intellectual tradition as the principle of identity or individuation. And so in this dialogue, we're anticipating some problems with that view, some objections to that view. So Descartes is the dualist who holds that there's a fundamental distinction within the nature of metaphysics, so the very nature of reality, between spirit and body, you might say, the immaterial and the material, the physical and the non-physical. And Descartes' scholastic language, drawing on the Latin, it's the division between res extensa, so physical or extended things, and res cogitans, or thinking things. So that's what we'll turn to next week. And that's what Miller attempts to solve the problem with, right? And so that's when we run into some problems with the soul view. And what's the major issue with the soul view? So how does Weyrob respond to that?
Well, since the soul is immaterial, it's not something that you can observe with your senses. And so how can you say that the same soul is inhabiting the same body that you saw like 2 weeks ago or something like that?
Yeah, right. So the conversation goes like this. Prove to me that it's at least conceivable that I will survive my body's death. Okay, we've run through a couple scenarios. You're more than your body, you're a soul. Unlike the Kleenex box, which is observable for its physical features, you're also a soul. And in fact, when I say you, I'm referring not to your bodily presence, but to your soul. So when he says, you're the person, Weyrob, you're the person with whom I had lunch at this restaurant Dorsey's last week, when I said I'm sitting across from you, what he really means is I'm sitting across from your soul, which just so happens to be lodged or housed in a particular body. And it's the body which, as a physical material substance, we can observe, that's supposed to, in every instance, coincide with or accompany or be conjoined in some way with the soul. And so that's when he gives this sort of terrestrial principle, that is a principle that he thinks might not hold in heaven, but same soul, same body. And then she says, well, if the soul is by definition an immaterial substance, which, by the way, in the 17th century, the same period in which Descartes was articulating this view, the English philosopher who inaugurated the social contract tradition, Thomas Hobbes. So John Locke was responding to Thomas Hobbes in many ways. Hobbes, so in the very same century as Descartes, his contemporary, he said that the very idea of immaterial substance is self-contradictory. It makes no fucking sense. And so Hobbes is an example of a strict materialist, as represented here by Weyrob. But because substance just means material. So you're saying like immaterial immateriality or immaterial materiality or something like that. But the problem is, if it is your soul that I recognize whenever I interact with you. So right now, I see that Noel is in this little square on my screen, his two-dimensional image, and maybe that was the same place I saw him last week on my screen, and I say, oh, I'm dealing with the same person. And when I say I'm dealing with the same person, Noel, the same person I was dealing with last week, I'm really saying I'm interacting with the same soul. Yet, how can I be sure of that if it's precisely the soul that I never observe? I'm only seeing a body. I'm not observing a soul. So I can't be certain that Noel is the same individual, or that Daniel is the same individual, or Amanda is the same individual with whom I interacted last week or whom I saw last week, because you could actually be housing an entirely different soul, and I would never know, right? But the point here is not a metaphysical one to repudiate the very concept or existence of souls. The problem with the soul view here as a response to the question of identity is an epistemological one. She's saying if it's true that it's through the soul that I achieve recognition of same identity or identity as such from one time to another, then it would, as a result, be entirely mysterious how I can ever do something so simple as come into one of these Zoom classes and recognize you as the same people that I've already known and are familiar with. But she says, that it's actually not mysterious. I do it all the time. We all do it. And not only with respect to others, but even with respect to ourselves. We maintain some recognition of self-identity across time, even if we have no immediate or direct access to this mysterious entity we call a soul. So she's saying there very well might exist souls in the world. She's not denying that. She says grave doubts about it. But her major point is to say, even if there are souls, it can't be because of them that we achieve the straightforward act of identity of one thing from one time to another. Does that make sense? So it must be through some other way. And so this is an example of modus tollens. So I'll share the screen now. Oh, hold on, just give me a second. All right, so let me share the screen. I have a more or less blank slide at the beginning because I wanted us to take some time to fill it in. So what are possible candidates or responses to the question of the I or personal identity, which despite superficial changes remains the same across time? But before we get into that, I just want to represent the argument that she gives here. So I called this by a fancy name, modus tollens, but it would look like this. So that's the argument that Weyrob is making in response to Miller. So again, this isn't a metaphysical conclusion denying the reality of souls. It's an important epistemological conclusion denying the role of souls in common acts of identity recognition or observation, right? So Miller uses the example of, or they both use the example of chocolates, right? So you know that this chocolate is a caramel because of the swirl it has on the outside, but you only make that connection between swirl and caramel because you've experienced both the swirl and the caramel. But in this instance, it's precisely the soul that we cannot experience, that we cannot, as it were, sink our teeth into. So we can't make that coherent recognition of identity based on the soul. Does that make sense? Okay, so next time I want to take some time to sort of compile a list, and we've already come up with some, right? So the soul can be the I. Weyrob thinks it's the body that is the I or the self. Locke, as we'll see, thinks it's consciousness, or less extravagantly, memory that is the I or the self. And so we can take some time to think about other potential options as responses to this difficult question. But with the time we have left, so we've got about 6 minutes, I want to just talk a little bit about Locke. And this will help you work through the second night and see some problems with the consciousness or memory view So I mentioned that in terms of the metaphysics of identity or selfhood, Locke is an important figure. And so this is how Locke, from his 1689 work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, defines personhood. And this, by the way, is a salient definition with respect to contemporary debates about abortion, reproductive rights, other kinds of human rights more generally, and so forth. So it's still very much relevant. But he says that a person is, so what a person stands for: a thinking being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself the same thinking thing in different times and places, which it does only by that consciousness, which is inseparable from thinking and seems to me essential to it, it being impossible for anyone to perceive without perceiving that he does perceive. And so this last line, after the semicolon, it being impossible for anyone to perceive without perceiving that he does perceive, that sort of perception is known in the literature as apperception. Oops, yeah, so I have that in the next. So apperception. To apperceive, so an additional A and P appended to the front of the word, to apperceive is not only to perceive or to think, but rather to perceive that you are perceiving, or to think that you are thinking. And so this is a special kind of self-consciousness that involves thinking, as we just characterized it, time, so it's thinking across time to maintain identity as one thinking or source or origination of thought at one point in time connected to another. And then how does this happen? Well, through memory. Memory, it seems, is it's like the membrane, as it were, that connects different person stages. And that's another way of thinking this. And we'll turn to the idea of person stages when we later on in several weeks come to the question of time and temporality. And so we'll engage with the 20th century philosopher David Lewis, who talks about temporal parts and person stages. And he's one of the philosophers, by the way, who's sort of lurking in the background of this John Perry dialogue. So it's memory that's important. And so what is identity? And not just personal identity, but what does identity at all mean? Because I can talk about identity in terms of my own being, but also the being of something like this coffee cup, an inanimate object. I'm talking about this coffee cup and not one of the 65 empty case coffee cups that are in my trash can because we don't have any janitorial service right now. I got to take my trash out. But so this coffee cup. Identity means being one thing and not another. So for example, like this blade of grass, it's of course in every important sense related or comparable to other blades of grass beside it. But I'm talking about this blade of grass and not others. So what does that mean if we're talking about the identity of this blade of grass or me or of this coffee cup? It means that an individual object cannot be in two places at once. Hence, Weyrob's pretty insistent principle that whatever personal identity amounts to, it has to involve numerical identity, which excludes even identical twins, so-called identical twins, from being really identical, because they don't occupy the same measure of space. So two distinct individuals cannot be in the same place at the same time. Otherwise, if they are, and this is what Leibniz, the philosopher Leibniz, described in his principle of the identity of indiscernibles. So if two things are indiscernible from each other, well, then they're identical. They have identity. Okay. And so Locke then is searching for what he calls the principle of individuation. So what is it that undergirds the identity of any particular entity? And so this is the principle that makes something the same thing over time. So here's an image of a man who was previously a toddler, right? So notice the strangeness that babies have a higher bone count than adults, right? Yet so if you look at a picture of yourself at 5 years old or something, you think, oh, that's me. So there's an identity claim between you, the observer, and the object observed. Yet there are countless differences here. So the question is, what is it that makes it a true statement to say that there is an identity that holds between these entities on the left and on the right? What is it that makes you and the child in the picture that you're turning to one and the same individual person, despite all of these changes?
I would argue. Oh, sorry.
Oh.
Is that a rhetorical question?
Yeah, well, go ahead. We're out of time, so I'll stop there. But these, just real quick, and we'll jump right back into this at the beginning next week. But these are the kinds of entities that Locke thinks make up all of reality and are importantly distinct in terms of what qualifies as the principle of individuation in each case. So person is different than an organism, but a person is an organism, but is importantly different in some measure, and is also a substance. And so we'll talk about these distinctions next time. But yeah, so I don't want to hold you too much longer, but Daniel, did you want to say?
Yeah, sorry. The thing about the baby and the adult human being, I would argue that like I once was in the same space as that baby. I occupied the same like physical space. I occupied the same like social roles as that baby once. And because I can remember or I know that like my connections to other people were the same once, then I can recognize that baby as myself.
Good, yeah. So I mean, what you said is pretty, I think we would take that as obvious and simple, but it's actually very complicated, those processes through which we make these points, because it's not your own personal memory. I mean, I don't remember being a baby, yet as you were sort of commenting, I can turn to people in my social milieu who do remember me. And so it's a turn to something even beyond my own consciousness or experience, which contributes at least to my understanding in terms of personal identity, connecting myself to the past and anticipating the future and so forth. And so this is just to, in terms of what you said, to point out the complexity and the mysteriousness of all this, despite what seems to be pretty straightforward. As Miller says in the dialogue, I don't even know if I can talk to you if you don't even know that you're the same person you were 5 minutes ago. That seems like something we all know if we know anything. Yet, how do we know that? It's something mysterious to be pondered, right? Yeah, are there any final comments or questions before we go? So I'll leave it there. And I'll speak a little bit more about Locke, and then as we get into Thursday session, I'll turn it over to Noel and Amanda, and perhaps a third partner, if there is a third partner at that point. But are you guys okay with correspondence? You have email addresses and everything? Okay, cool, great. All right. Okay, so I'll see you guys on Thursday if there are no questions for me. And I hope you guys are having a good week. So I'll see you then.
Thank you.
Bye.